Baruch Hashem, today's daf yomi is Bava Metzia Peiches, Bava Metzia 88, and we're going to dedicate the daf to Yeshua for Am Yisrael, Atzal for the Shvuyim, Shmira for the Chayalim. We're going to start on the bottom line of Peizayin Amabez, the last line of 87b. Says the Gemara on the last line of 87b, Amar Rebbe Yanai. The Rebbe Yanai taught, Ein ha-tevel mischayev b'maiser ad sheyira pnei habayis. So according to Rabbi Yanai, if you have tevel, what's tevel? Tevel are those crops that you have not yet taken a tithe from them, that they're untithed crops. So these crops, they're not obligated to take a tithe. The meiser, we're on 88a at the top, 88a. You're not obligated to take meiser from them until such time as the crops come through the entrance to the house, meaning to say that they go through the main front door, not through the roofs or the skylights. So until that time, Rabbi Yanai says you're not obligated to tithe them. And its proof for this is the pasuk, because it says, "Biarti hakodesh," shenemar biarti hakodesh min habayis. I took out the kodesh, the sacred, from the bayis, from the house. We see until such time as it goes through the front of the house, you're not obligated to do the meiser. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, "Afil chatzar kovas." Rabbi Yochanan says, even if you have a courtyard, even if it comes into your courtyard, that's going to obligate you to take a tithe. Meaning, it doesn't need to go into your house; it just needs to go into your courtyard. Now, why are we discussing all this? Just to say, the reason is the Gemara is on a little bit of a tangent because we had discussed the rights of workers to eat in the fields. And so then we got onto a little bit of a tangent. And whenever there's a part of the Mishnah, which there's no discussion of directly, there's no tractate for in the Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara will go into it and spend more time discussing it than usual. So since there's no tractate for in the Babylonian Talmud for Meiser Sheni, therefore the Gemara is going to spend more time on it. So, yeah. There's Mishnahs, but there's no Babylonian Talmud. So that's why there's a Jerusalem Talmud on Zerayim, but there's no Babylonian Talmud. So therefore, for this reason, the Gemara is spending more time than usual on it. So therefore, we say Rabbi Yanai's position is that you're obligated to do the meiser once it comes through the front of the house, whereas Rabbi Yochanan's in the position that you're obligated to take the tithe from the produce once it comes into your courtyard. As it says, "Ve'achlu b'sharecha v'saveu," they ate in your gates and they're satisfied. And prior to that, it says, "V'nasato levi v'ager v'yasom v'almana," that you give it to the Levite. So it means to say that from the moment that it comes into your gates, you're obligated to give it to the Levite. Yes.
What happens if the farmer who takes his post directly to the market takes it to its
So we'll see. The Gemara is going to discuss that. So the Gemara says, "Rabbi Yochanan nami yaksiv min habayis." So what does Rabbi Yochanan do for the fact that the verse says when it comes into your house? Amar chatzer dumya debayis. So he says, no, the courtyard is similar to the house. He says that verse is to teach us that a courtyard is similar to the house. Habayis hamishtamer, just like the house is something that is protected. Av chatzer hamishtamer. So too, it only refers to a courtyard that has like a fence around it. But if the courtyard doesn't have a fence around it, you're not liable. That's what the house teaches us. Rabbi Yanai nami yaksiv b'sharecha. What does Rabbi Yanai do with the fact that the verse states in your gates? Only by the way, he says, well, the point of this is to teach us the Ma'alei Derech Shar, that you're supposed to take it that you're only obligated in your house if it comes in via the gate. But not if it comes through via the roof steps or some backwards way. You're only liable to the tithing obligation once it comes through the front door. So we've seen from here that when does the tithe obligation take place? According to Rabbi Yanai, it takes place once it comes through the main entrance to the house, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, once it comes into your gates. So in this context, the Gemara says there's a question on this. Masav Rav Chanina Chuzah challenges both Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan from the verse that we were discussing in the Brisa that we had just discussed. It says, when you come into the vineyard of your friend and you eat the grapes according to your desire. You eat it according to your appetite, and you do not put it in. You're allowed to eat the grapes when you come in, but you're not allowed to put it into your utensil. So the Brisa tells us kinaf according to your desire. Kach nafsho shapoel kinaf. So what does this mean when it says kinaf? It teaches us kach nafsho shapoel, meaning to say, thus is the soul of the worker, meaning to say manavshach ochal, that the manavshacha, that the Bava Metzia, meaning to say the owner of the field, ochal pater, just like he's allowed to eat in the field and he's exempt. Af nafsho shapoel ochal pater. So when it says kinavshacha, it means to say, just like the owner is allowed to eat in the field, so too the worker is allowed to eat in the field. Just like the owner, while he's in the field, he can eat it and he'll be exempt. So too the worker can eat it and be exempt, which implies halokeach chayev, that the person who purchases it, this goes to Harold's question, which he asked a moment ago, that who is exempt from tithing in this manner? If you are the owner or the worker in the field, but if you are somebody who's purchasing it, from the moment you purchased it, you're going to be responsible. Why? Rashi tells us the mekach machshiv kigvar malacha, that once you purchased it, the reason why you're not liable until you bring it to your house is because you don't have any intent that it's completed, the work has been completed. But once you purchase it, then it's the intent is that the work has been completed. So we see from here halokei chayev, that the person who purchases it is responsible. Ma'ala v'sadeh, doesn't it mean in the field? And from the fact that Torah tells us that that he's going to be responsible even in the field, he's responsible. I mean, to say the worker is from the fact that the Torah tells us that the worker is exempt, that it teaches us that the purchaser is responsible even in the field. And so therefore, and so we see from here, it's not like Rabbi Yanai or Rabbi Yochanan, because we're saying that even in the field, he's going to be responsible. So the Gemara says, no, what we're talking about here is Hamarav Papa, Hacha B'te'ena Hamedes Begina V'nofa Notel Chatzar Askinan. So what we're talking about is, we're saying that what we're talking about here is where there is a tree, but the tree, we're talking about, let's say, a fig tree, which is standing in the garden, but the branches are going into the courtyard. And so there, means to say the branch, even though it's in the field, the branches of the tree are in either the house or the courtyard. And so therefore you're going to be responsible. So because even though it's still in the field, its branches are in the field or the courtyard. So the Gemara says, so if that's the case, why is the owner not responsible under those circumstances? Why is it just the worker who's responsible? The Gemara explains, so the reason is that the Balabayas, his eyes are on the trunk, because he's looking at the principal, and so since his eyes are on the trunk, it's not completed. Whereas the purchaser, his eyes are on the fruit, and therefore it's as though it's completed. So therefore, the answer to the question of the Brisa, why is the purchaser responsible, why is the purchaser responsible at that point? And the answer is, even though it's in the field, the answer is because the branches are in the domain in which he would be responsible. But and so he's looking at the fruit, whereas the owner is looking at the trunk, which is in the field still. The Gemara asks a general question: is the purchaser ever responsible to tithe, biblically speaking? Why should the purchaser be responsible? Tanya, didn't we learn in a Brisa? Why were the Brisa says, what's the reason why the the chanios, the shabbeis. What's the reason why the shops or the stores of Beis Hino, which is like a village outside Jerusalem, what's the reason why they were destroyed? Shalosh shanim kodem Yerushalayim. Why were they destroyed 3 years prior to Jerusalem? What's the reasoning? Because they only followed the words of the Torah. Meaning to say, that which was prohibited from the sages, they found permission from the Torah. Meaning to say, the sages prohibited something, but they found a way to say, actually, even though you're prohibiting it, the Torah really allows it. And what was this case where the sages prohibited and they allowed it? Because the sages used to, because they would expound the verse. They would expound the verse as follows, or on top of 88b. It says aser ta'aser. It says in the pasuk. This is coming up. We're going to read this. Aser ta'aser ve'achalta es tvuas zarecha. Tithe you shall tithe all the crops of your seed. Ayotze asadesh ana v'shana. That's the pasuk. Aser ta'aser ve'achalta. So why do we have the two psukim next to each other? It means to say, they would say that who's obligated to tithe it? Only if the owner is the one that eats it. Aser ta'aser v'achalta. That you're obligated to eat it. That if you're the one who grows it and eats it, then you're obligated to tithe it. V'lo mocher tuas zarecha. And not the one, v'lo mocher, and not the one who sells it to somebody else. If you sell it to somebody else, you don't have to tithe it. Tuas zarecha, the crops of your seed, v'lo lokeach, and not if you're purchasing it. So if that's the case, why do we need a verse to tell us that the purchaser is not obligated to tithe it? When in that case where in that circumstance we say he's not obligated to tithe it, but we know that he's never obligated to tithe it. Meaning to say, why would we need a pasuk to tell us, like we said on the previous page, that the purchaser is exempt from tithing, and under those circumstances? So from here we learn that he's always exempt biblically. Meaning to say, why does there need to learn, like we learned in the previous page, Kinav Shecha, to tell you that the worker is exempt from Meiser? We can anyway learn it out that anybody who purchases it is exempt. So the Gemara says, you're right. The idea that a worker is exempt from Meiser is only going to be midrabanan, ela midrabanan. The idea that a worker is exempt from Meiser is only midrabanan. Ukra, and this verse that tells us is Kinav Shecha, that's just an asmachta ba'alma. That's just like a support for the rabbinic idea that a worker is exempt from Meiser. That's just a support for it. But we anyways don't need a verse to teach it to us, because anybody who purchases it is never exempt. So we don't need a specific verse to tell us the worker is exempt. The rabbis are just finding a support. So if that's the case, El Kinav Shecha L'mayasa. So what do we do with this word Kinav Shecha? So what are we doing with this word Kinav Shecha? We had said it to teach us that the worker is exempt, but we don't need it for that, because we had said in the previous page, just like the person who owns the field is exempt while it's in the field, so too is the worker. But we now know we don't need a verse to tell us that, because the worker is never biblically obligated, because Beis Hino expounded that to mean that they're not obligated. And they got punished for it, but they were correct. So if that's the case, what's Kinav Shecha teaching us? Look at the Tanya. So it's to teach us a different brisa. It's to tell us Kinav Shecha, Manav Shecha, just like the owner of the field, Im Chasamta Patur, just like the owner, if you muzzle yourself, you're not, meaning to say under those circumstances you're exempt. Af pol, so to a worker, Im Chasamta, if you made a decree it made an arrangement with the worker from the beginning that he cannot eat from the fruits, or you muzzled him against his will, potter, you're going to be exempt from lashes. And meaning to say that there's a separate law that if you muzzle your ox while your ox is plowing in your field, you're prohibited to do that. And basically, you're going to get lashes because it says you're not allowed to muzzle the ox when it threshes. But let's say you muzzle your worker when he threshes, then you're not going to get lashes for that. Just like if you muzzle yourself, you're not going to get lashes because you're not obligated to eat. So too, if you muzzle the worker, your worker, you're not going to get lashes. But an animal you would, ironically. And so we learned this out from the words kinavshecha. So Marzutra challenges, now we're going to go back to the dispute between Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan about at what point does the obligation to tithe take effect? That Rabbi Yanai says it takes effect when it comes into the entrance to the house. Rabbi Yochanan says when it comes into the courtyard. So most of Marzutra challenges this idea that you don't have to tithe while it's still in the field. We learned in the Mishnah in Maasros, Ezu Goranon. Now, what is considered the Goranon? Meaning to say, what's the Goranon? At what time, at what point are the fruits going to be considered like they have gone through the process called Goren, at which point they're obligated to be tithed? So, Ezu Goranon Maasros. What is this finish point for tithing? When is the point? So the point is bekishuim ubediluim, by kishuim or cucumbers, bediluim or squash, misha pasku. From once the flowers they start to blossom. Amar Rabbi Asi, and what does this mean once they start to blossom? What does that mean? He says, Amar Rabbi Asi, misha yinatel pikas shoan. Once the flower that's on the top of their head, which is called the picase, once it falls off. So basically, at what point is the tithe? One point is the obligation to tithe? Once the flower falls off. Ma'alav mishei pasku afilu b'sadeh isn't when it falls off even in the field, and this is a direct obligation, a direct contradiction to Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan, who say no, it's only when it brings it into your house. The Gemara says no, mishei pasku b'payis. No, that it means to say only when it falls off in the house. And the Mishnah is teaching us that even according to this approach, even after you bring it to the house, which is the space, you really don't have to, you're not obligated to tithe until it falls off, which is the completion. The Gemara says, if that's the case, why does the Mishnah use the language from when it falls off, which implies at an earlier point, it should say, even until the later point, that you're not obligated to tithe it. The Gemara says, no, it wouldn't have used that language. Itana, if it said until the time it falls off, Havamina ad degamar lepi kustayu, I would have said until all of the fruits, all of the flowers fall off the fruits. Kamashmuan, misha yipasku michayaschui pikusaya. Once the flowers start falling off, that's when I would say. So now we have another challenge to Rabbi Yana. Yes, sir.
So it's when the flowers start falling off.
In your house, if you brought it into your house, and then the flowers start falling off, that's when your obligation is to tithe it. I never saw a flower on a cucumber, but I never saw cucumbers growing in the field. I assume they're the case. I never saw a flower on a squash either. But again, I'm not a farmer. Well, you have to bring it into the house. You have to bring it into the house. Yes, correct. So the sowing, we said, is also considered the completion of the work as well. Yeah, once they buy it, that's considered to be the right. So then the Gemara says another challenge to Rabbi Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan. Masav Marzucha brother of Nachman Gorano. What's the time when they're Gorano Meiser Chayav Mishum Tevel Mishatigamer Mu'alchan? What's the moment where we view these crops as being completed so that you're obligated to tithe them? What is that? When you bring them into your house. Doesn't this mean meaning to say that when it doesn't mean when you bring it to your house. No, that was a mistake that I made. It says when you complete to melachas hachnasatan doesn't mean afilu basa. That means when you gather it in together, even in your field, then you're obligated to tithe. The Gemara says no. Hachnasa bias. When you bring it into your house, zeu gmar melachtan. That's considered not when you gather it up in your field. Bibayas same or alternatively, hachakama Rabbi Yanai. When Rabbi Yanai says that it's when you bring it into the house, that's bezeisim v'anavim. That only applies to grapes and olives. The lav b'nei gorininu, because you don't really take them onto the threshing floor. You just bring them straight into the house, and that's the end of their work. But even Rabbi Yanai would say by chitin and saorim, by wheat and barley, that you're obligated right when you bring it onto the threshing floor, because it says explicitly the word goren in the Talmud, in the Torah. So okay, fine. So earlier we had said that we know that a worker is allowed to eat when it is connected to the ground. So how do we know? Meaning to say, when the worker is harvesting the field, he's harvesting his crops that's connected to the ground. When he's picking them, he can eat while doing that. But now the Gemara is going to say, Ashkachan Adam b'mechubar. Okay, we understand if a person is picking the crops, he can eat the crops that he picks while he's picking them. But b'mechubar, Ashkachan Adam b'mechubar, sure b'tolish. And also we know that ox, when he's threshing, meaning the grain is removed from the ground already because he's walking around and with whatever he does and stamping on it, and he's basically separating the bran from the grain, so from the berry. Well, if that's the case, so we know that the ox can eat then. So we know that the man can eat the crops when he's picking them. A worker can eat when he's picking them, and the ox can eat when it's removed from the ground. Adam b'tolish we know. And how do we know that the person can eat it when the crops are already removed from the ground? How do we know? Then he could pick it. So the Gemara says, well, we're going to derive it from a logical argument, from a kal v'chomer mishor, from an ox. Mashor she'eino ochel b'mechubar, just like an ox, that the Torah does not say explicitly that he can eat from the food when he's plowing, when he's something attached to the ground, he can eat it. Ochel b'tolish, he can eat it when something is removed. Adam, a person, she'ochel b'mechubar, who's allowed to eat when it's still attached to the ground. Eino din she'ochel b'tolish, for sure he can eat it once it's already moved. The Gemara says, what kind of logical argument is that? Malashor shekein atam mitzuva al chasimaso. An ox, you're obligated to muzzle the ox. And so therefore it's stricter and in that area. So therefore maybe the Torah allows to eat from the removed property. Tomer ba'adam, how can you say this by a man? He doesn't have that stringency of that you're not allowed to muzzle him, that you're allowed to muzzle the man. So the Gemara says, "Va adam mitzuva chasimaso." So maybe a Marison is obligated. So the Gemara says a person should be prohibited to muzzle another person when he's working, mikal v'chomer mishor, from a logical argument from an ox. Mashor she'iatam mitzuva lachyoso. Just like an ox who you're not allowed to, you're not commanded to make sure that the ox lives. Atam mitzuva chasima. So you're obligated to muzzle such an ox. You're obligated not to muzzle the ox. Adam shatam mitzuva lachyoso. A person who, like we saw in yesterday's parsha, you're obligated to let them live. Eino din shatam mitzuva chasima. So for sure, you shouldn't be allowed to muzzle them. So Amar Kra, the verse says, Kinav shecha. So the pasuk tells us, when you come into the field of your friend and you eat these grapes according to your soul, kanav shecha, kanav sho shel po'al, meaning to say, like the soul of the worker. Ma navsho im chasamto pater, just like the owner, if he muzzled himself, he's exempt from, and so he's exempt. He doesn't have a prohibition. Af pol, so to the worker, im chasamto pater. So that's tell us that if you muzzle your worker when he works, you're not in violation of the prohibition. Only another animal, only an animal. Ella Adam betalash mina. And so therefore, we're back to the question we asked at the beginning. How do we know that a person is allowed to eat from the food that he's working on, even if it's been removed from the ground before he started working on it? Amakra. So we're going to go back to the idea that it says in the verse, Kama Kama Shtei Pamim. It says, when you come into the field of your friend, and Kitavo Bekamat Reyacha, and you take the berries, and you're allowed to eat the berries, but you can't bring the sickle al Kamat Reyacha. Kama Kama Shtei Pamim. V'meinu inyan la'adam b'ben chubar, and we don't need it to teach us that a person is allowed to eat with something that's attached to the ground. Taneo inyan la'adam b'talashit. So therefore, derive from it that you're allowed to use it for a man to eat something that's detached from the ground. Rabbi Ami says a different reasoning how we know a worker can eat from the food that's already detached. Rabbi Ami Amar Adam b'talash l'tzarach kra. You don't need a verse. He says, Ksiv ki tavo b'kerem reyacha. When you come into the field, the vineyard of your friend, how do we know that it means that it's to pick from the grapes? It could be that it means that he hired you to schlep the grapes. And Amar Rahman Alechol, and the Torah says you could eat. Fine, so that's Rabbi Ami. So the Gemara says, we had said earlier that an ox, it says explicitly in the Torah that the ox is allowed to eat. You can't muzzle the ox while it's working on food that's already been detached from the ground. How do we know you're not allowed to muzzle an ox while it's working on food, on crops that are still connected? The Gemara says, we'll learn that from a person. Just like a person can't eat with something that's removed from the ground, he's not allowed to. The Torah didn't write explicitly, but but while it's attached to the ground, the Torah is explicit. Sure, an ox that can eat with something that's detached from the ground. For sure it should be the case that he can eat with something that is already, for sure it should be the case that you're not allowed to muzzle him with something that's attached to the ground. Where it says you can't learn a kava chomer from that. There's a total difference between a man and an ox. The man, you're obligated to support him, whereas the ox, you're not. So the Gemara says, well, why is that? What do you mean there's no obligation to allow the ox to live? Maybe you should be obligated to let the ox live. From a logical argument, just like a person who you're allowed to muzzle, you're obligated to live, to help live. An ox who you're obligated not to muzzle, so for sure you should have to live. Now the pasuk says that your brother will live with you. We did this in yesterday's parasha. You allow your brother to live with you. There's an obligation to let your brother live, but not an ox. And so if that's the case, how do we know that there is an obligation not to muzzle the ox when it's working on something that's still attached to the ground? It's based upon the fact that it says reyecha reyecha shtei pamim. It says the word reyecha when you come into the vineyard of your friend, and also it says there kitavo bekamat reyecha when you come into the field, the wheat field or the barley field of your friend. Lo tanif al kamat reyecha. It says the word reyecha twice. If it doesn't apply to a person to tell us that he's not that he's allowed to eat while he's working on something that's attached to the ground, because we could have learned it from one of those words, to teach us that an ox that's attached to the ground, you're not allowed to muzzle. So the Gemara brings a different reason. You're not calling the ox reyecha, it's saying the field of your friend. Ravina says, Gemara is going to give a different answer, both for how we know that a person is allowed to eat some while food is detached, and the ox that's still that you can't muzzle while it's connected to the ground. Gemara says, Ravina Amar, well, Adam b'talash l'shar b'mechubar tzricha krai. A person that is allowed to eat something detached from the ground while he's working, and an ox that you can't muzzle while it's still attached, they don't need a pasuk. Why? Because it says l'tachsom Because it says you're not allowed to muzzle the ox while it does its threshing. And even though the verse refers to an ox, we say every creature is prohibited you're not allowed to muzzle any creature while it's working. The alfina and shor mishabes, because we learned this out from the ox that appears by Shabbos. We did this in Bava Metzia, you remember. It says on Shabbos that just like the ox is not allowed to do any work, and since the Torah says v'chol b'amtecha, says you can't do any work on Shabbos with your ox, your donkey, v'chol b'amtecha, and all your animals. So why does it specify the ox? To teach us that wherever it says ox, it means all creatures. So too, when it says you can't muzzle your ox here, it means you can't muzzle any creature that's working you. So the Torah doesn't need to write the word ox. It could just say lo tadush b'chasima, and we would know it's everyone. So sure, the kasa rachmana lamali. Why does it say that you're not allowed to specifically muzzle an ox? Why specifically an ox? To compare the chosem, the one who muzzles, i.e. the human, to the one who is muzzled, i.e. the ox. And the one who is muzzled, i.e. the ox, to the human. Just like a person, just like the person can eat while he's working in something attached to the ground. So to the ox can eat with food that's attached to the ground. Just like the nechsam, i.e. the ox can eat with something that's you can't muzzle if it's detached from the ground. So to the human being can eat with something that's detached from the ground if that's what he's working on. This is today's daf yomi, but let's not lose the big picture through the weeds. And the big picture is take away from this lesson of the Gemara a very simple idea that a worker is allowed to eat. You have to allow your worker, if he's working on the crops, to eat, and you're not allowed to muzzle an ox while it's working for you. This is basic ideas, very basic ideas. Also want to mention that tomorrow is on a Sunday schedule, so the daf yom will be at a similar time right when davening ends in the morning, but we won't do it at 6:30 a.m. Okay, any questions? Any questions about this? Okay, Rachel Elise has a question.